Hey class, this video is going to be about T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns. I handed you out this essay in class day 1, week 5, which depending on when you're listening to this was probably today for you. This is a personal essay and it was one of the winning entries for the New York Times personal essay competition. New York Times Student Learning Network does competitions throughout the year. Last year I had 3 entries for my 7th grade class and their persuasive writing competition. So they also do a narrative-based personal essay competition, and that's ongoing right now. So if anybody's interested in entering that, I didn't really have in mind entering any of our pieces, but if you are interested in that, let me know. T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns is one of the winning entries from 2022, I believe, by Ruhani Chhabra. The only rules for the New York Times, and one of the things I like about their competitions, particularly the personal essay one, is the only stipulation is that you write about an event in your life. It must be about you, a personal experience. And by the way, we're doing that as well. If I haven't, I think that's been implicit, but I haven't explicitly stated that you're actually writing it about you. This is not creative writing. This is not writing about some character that you've made up. This is a personal essay about you, told from the first person point of view. So the New York Times' only stipulation is that you write about a personal experience from the first person point of view that is meaningful or life-changing or reveals something about a truth or something meaningful to you. So we're pretty much going to follow that. The only difference for my essay that I'm having you guys write with a Reflection Me personal essay is that you're writing about these life-changing and meaningful experiences, or coming to an understanding of something meaningful based or through the prism of your core values. So this is something that's really important for me, is that you approach these problems in life and how you make meaning of them through your own prism of your core values and traits. Not mine, not somebody else, not what's being externally imposed on you, but your own core values and traits that are unique to you. And that naturally will also lead to voice and authenticity in your writing, and put a little heart in your writing, which, as you guys know, is what I'm all about. Now, T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns, I handed this out in class again day 1 this week, and the reason I did is because I wanted it to serve as a mentor text, so you guys could start looking at the way of crafting a personal essay and maybe thinking of how you want to do yours yourself when we get in the writer's workshop on day 2 this week and we start drafting this thing. This is just an example of how you can do it. This more or less does fit in the handout that I gave you guys, the template. You had to see how it fits on the story arc. Remember, we have our story arc where you have exposition, you have the conflict or inciting incident, you have the rising or complicating action, you have the climax or moment of epiphany. In this case, it's probably going to be less of a climax, although the climax oftentimes, more often than not, will coincide with the epiphany, falling action, and exposition or resolution or understanding in this case. So it's your narrative arc. And I ask you guys to place Ruhani's story in a way that fits on these plot points. And you can do it. As we found out in class, it didn't fit perfectly. Things were out of sequence, but you still can put it in there utilizing this structure. I want to start by talking about the title, T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns. For any of you guys that have traveled, by the way, T.S.A. stands for Transportation Security Authority, Transportation Security Administration. I guess I should have looked that up before I made this video. Okay, I just paused it and looked it up, and apparently it's Transportation Security Administration. So T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns is an effective title, and oh, cool. The actual highlighter I use is kind of the color of a cinnamon bun. That's cool. It is, in my opinion, an effective title because it's setting up this contrast point or this intrigue in the reader as to how T.S.A. and Cinnamon Buns go together. How in the world are these two things related, and why are they in the title of this personal essay? T.S.A., as you know, if you're an experienced traveler, if you've flown before, that's that security checkpoint that you have to go through at every airport to be able to board an airplane. Some experiences are better than others, depending on what airport you are in the U.S. and in the world. I've had some crazy experiences at various T.S.A. places around the world. Some weird experiences in Japan, India, different places, in America, in Phoenix. Actually, Phoenix is pretty good. But the cinnamon bun part is a point of intrigue. So you're kind of wondering, hey, where's Ruhani going with this? You'll notice she has the image of the airplane. I think that's a pretty good image, pretty snazzy, pretty cool. It's interesting that she's got the non-tarmac airplane image, where you normally would board an airplane through the tarmac, not from the door popping down and revealing stairs that you walk up on from the tarmac. Sort of the old school approach. But that's kind of a cool image, I think. I'm not sure if that image can be viewed symbolically with what the story means, and I don't have enough active brain cells this morning or had enough coffee to try to figure that one out, but maybe there's some sort of connection with that. Now you look at this first paragraph, and that's the first thing I want to point out about what Ruhani's done, is you'll see some people talk about, and I think even one of the articles that I shared with you, or one of the readings this week, it talks about the 5-paragraph format. I want you to start, again, reimagining how you view writing in terms of structure. 5 paragraphs, if we were limited to a 5-paragraph essay, technically in this story, we'd be done before it even started. I mean, we'd be down there talking about the Charlie Brown Christmas, and that would be the end of it. And then we'd have to go watch the Charlie Brown Christmas special, because that would be the only story we would get that day. We would not get this story from Ruhani. So she starts her story off with, you're going to have to take that thing off, sir. I need to get better at being able to draw a straight line. And you guys that are artists out there maybe can get with me and help me out with that. But she starts off with saying, you are going to have to take that thing off, sir. Remember we talked about the various, or if you watched my video on narrative writing strategies, one of the things you would want to do typically in a narrative when you're first getting started, for sure, is start with a good hook. And actually every narrative advanced writer as well would incorporate a good solid hook. In this case, they're using the quote. Remember, quotes were or dialogue was one of the options for starting off your narrative, your personal essay. So you're going to have to take this thing off, sir, is not something that our protagonist, first person protagonist said, or it's not something that was said to them. It was something that was heard. This was something that was directed at her father. Notice that this is some of the more subtle aspects of this. Notice that this is a command. He's not saying even please or can you do this. He's formulating this as a command, the person. We don't know who this person is, but just from that first line alone, you're already getting the sense that there's a power imbalance, that there's someone that's being commanded to do something, and they're going to have to do that thing as a stipulation. We don't know if this is someone being arrested or someone being harassed or someone, maybe from the title, we can already imagine that it's at a security checkpoint in an airport, and that gets revealed in the very next line where it says, yet another T.S.A. officer had just arrived. This also implies very quickly, again, very subtly, and this is what you kind of have to do when you're limited to 500. Oh, by the way, yes, that's another thing. The New York Times limits their personal essays to 500 to 650 words, I believe. Ours are limited to between 500 and 750. Correct me if I'm wrong in my own stipulation there, but I believe that's what ours are. So you have to have certain elements of your account that are embedded and hidden and might have to be sort of extracted by your reader. You have to trust your reader to be able to make sense of certain elements. We don't have time to describe every element of what happened within a 500 to 750 word account. So you've got to give your reader, you got to trust them to be able to build in some of this meaning making. So when you say yet another T.S.A. officer had just arrived, this is a way of implying that you're now being essentially ganged up on. That, hey, one person wasn't enough. The one person that had power up here to give the command, hey, you're going to have to do this right now, sir, almost like a police officer arresting someone. And that can be implied that it wasn't good enough, that the person's resisting, right? They're resisting arrest, or resisting, in this case, whatever the command is at the security checkpoint. We'll find that out in a second. Actually, you already know, you've seen the story. So you needed another person in, yet another means that there's already one, and that there was already another one there, and we have yet another one. So it's given this notion. And when you're reading this, you don't necessarily explicitly make sense of it on such a conscious level, but you're unconsciously aware of this, whether you realize it or not, as you read this. This is affecting you rhetorically as you read it, whether you're conscious of it or not. So I'm just trying to make you guys conscious of the fact of what Ruhani consciously did in her writing to affect a very powerful story without really having to say much at all. Here we're probably, 20 words into this? Do a little word count. We're 20 words into this, and we already know so much. 19 words. So we're 19 words into this, and we already have a lot of information here about what's going on that's going to act as exposition in building up the climax of this story and the meaning-making aspect of it in the aftermath. She says, I cast a nervous glance at my father, who was extremely calm, even as he explained for the third time that he couldn't unwrap the turban on his head. One, it would take too long to put back on. Two, it was against his faith. Interesting contrast there with the 1 and the 2. I'll get to that in a second. But the daughter, in this case, we'll find out that this is his daughter. We still don't know her identity yet. This is our first person protagonist. I cast a nervous glance at my father. Why was she nervous? Interesting. Not sure why she'd be nervous. It looks like this is a guy who's extremely calm. We'll find out later in the story he's been through this before. So why she's particularly nervous about it, not sure. But it's important to understand that when she uses the word extremely calm, she's making it clear to you as the reader that my dad wasn't just making it through this or enduring this difficult situation. He was doing it at an extremely calm, respectful level. Okay, everything was cool. He was just saying, as we'll find out again, based on his religion, why he couldn't comply with what they were asking him to do, but he was doing it in a way that was extremely calm. This wasn't an argument. This is what wasn't him sort of, as it relates to his faith, you're supposed to have certain. So he's calm because part of what his faith of Sikhism requires of him are these type of character traits that he exhibits throughout. So that's also part of the story and part of the meaning making of the story. It's interesting that she says, 1, it would take too long to put back on, and 2, it was against his faith. 1 is simply about convenience. Would be inconvenient to take it off. Well, sorry, sir, that's security regulations. You're going to have to take that thing off. I'm sorry if it's going to be inconvenient, but we can't make everybody happy. That's what the security officer's thinking. That's a totally different deal versus 2, it's against your faith. Now, again, we talk about ethical lenses, where ethical lenses can collide. Him having this principle and living in this country where he has this faith-based belief system where he's not to take off his turban versus him being required to do so. This is fine. But what we have to understand here and make sense of is he doesn't have a right to utilize whatever airline he's using in the airport as a conduit for that. He doesn't have a right to do this and have a right for this to comply with his religious beliefs. He can just get in a car, or he can Uber his way across the country, right? Or he can take a train, or he can just get in his car and drive to wherever he's going, from Phoenix to New York or San Francisco or whatever. So he doesn't have a right to impose his will in this case. And I know Ruhani is trying to get her reader to be empathetic towards this, but I think we also need to keep that in perspective. So the sentence hung heavily in the cinnamon-scented air. I resisted the urge to run through the metal detector, shoes on and everything. Here she introduces the cinnamon-scented air, where we get vivid descriptive language that relates to the title, right? The Cinnamon Buns. That's our first introduction of that and how that's going to be relevant. The cinnamon-scented air, we find out later, the cinnamon buns represent freedom from scrutiny for Ruhani and her father. So just smelling the cinnamon-scented air is almost like a tantalizing, almost like reminds me of one of those cartoons, like Looney Tune cartoons, where the smoke reaches out from the fire and it's got this hand and it's kind of like motioning you with the finger that's, hey, come this way. It's tantalizing. It's almost beckoning you to be at that thing that it represents, which is freedom and freedom from scrutiny. So she's feeling that in that moment as she's smelling and associating that smell of the cinnamon with that freedom. And she's thinking, well, man, I just got this feeling where I just want to run through this metal detector with my shoes on and everything. I'm supposed to take shoes off too, which I'm not a big fan of. So, but what would the problem be with that? Well, embarrassment's the key word right here. This is all about embarrassment. She's now old enough at 12 years old to be embarrassed by her father. Maybe if she was 6 years old, it wouldn't be a big deal. She wouldn't even be aware of it. But at 12 years old, she's old enough to be embarrassed. This notion of being able to run through the metal detectors also gives you an indication that she is old enough to do that now. And again, if you're 6 years old, you would not only not even have that thought, you wouldn't necessarily even have that ability. I mean, you would in a sense, but not so clearly as a 12-year-old. The 12-year-old is starting to kind of get their own legs underneath them, so to speak. And she now has this mindset where she's got the freedom to be who she wants to be and become who she wants to be. And that person might be different from her dad. And she has the ability to literally run away from him, run through the security detector, get away from this embarrassing situation, distance herself from her dad. But what would that itself do? It would send off all the bells and whistles and she'd be even more embarrassed. Now that would really be a scene, and that scene would be directed at her, the already awkward, pimply faced, painfully aware of how awkward she is, 12-year-old girl. At least now it's just guilt by association with her dad, right? But if she does this thing that she has the impulse to do, then it's all going to be about her. So I think that's interesting to kind of set up this notion that she's old enough and mature enough to take action that runs counter to her dad, but she doesn't follow that impulse because of those reasons. She talks about the faith. This is exposition right here. I don't know if you guys got this when you were doing this in class, but it's giving you the exposition of what her faith is, her father's faith, the turban significance, which we didn't even know what that was. We just found out up here it was just going to have to take that thing off. We found out it's the holiday season. Now we can sort of become a little bit sympathetic to the security officers, right? And the administration to the extent that we weren't before. Now we can. It's like, hey, they're busy. We've been there. I've traveled during the holiday season. It's crazy. Some experiences have been better than others. I've seen people hung up in situations like this where it becomes this embarrassing moment where you're like, come on, man, just do whatever they're telling you to do and let's get on with it. We got places we got to go. So she said it shouldn't have turned out like this. It should have just been this, it was otherwise this great idea we had to visit relatives. It was going to be our version of the Charlie Brown Christmas until we hit the airport. And notice how she said we reached the dreaded corner of the airport. I love how she says dreaded corner. Again, this is descriptive language. This is also embedded language because her saying dreaded corner gives you two additional aspects of this, right, that are built in. Again, you talk about show, not tell. She could tell you why this is a dreaded corner. She could tell you details about her past experiences. But in this one sentence, dreaded corner, or these even two words, we find out a couple of things. One, they feel like they're cornered. Literally, metaphorically, they feel cornered. This is telling you that she feels, in this being who she is in this society, she feels cornered, right? She feels like she can't breathe. Also, the dreaded corner, the fact that it's dreaded, means they've experienced it before. You only dread something that you've experienced before and it was unpleasant, and you now know you're going to go through it again. So dreaded, that simple one word dreaded, is not only a powerful descriptor and evokes emotion for your reader. We'll talk about pathos later, but it also gives this sense that they've experienced it before. She doesn't even have to tell you. Again, 500 word limit here, 600 word limit, 650. She doesn't have time to recount all the stories. One word, dreaded, tells you that she feels like she's painted in a corner by society based on who she is. And it also tells you that this has happened before. And this is just painting the picture. Again, pathos, that they're painting it. They're trapped in a corner. They're literally trapped. That's the word I think of when I say the dreaded corner of the airport. It's like they're trapped. She distracts herself by concentrating on the sugary aroma. We get a reference to sugar, which will be countered by her later experience with that, coming from the diner in the terminal. I imagine this is a Cinnabon. We always ate there before our flights. I love their cinnamon buns. I associated a peculiar sense of freedom with those baked goods. Again, you're getting an objective correlative here, the cinnamon buns. The cinnamon buns are serving as an objective correlative for freedom, this idea of freedom. I hope you guys don't mind that I ditched the highlighter. It was just too hard to work, so I'm just going to use this. All right, so their sweet taste meant we'd finish with security freed of scrutiny. So the sweet taste of the cinnamon buns is associated with the sweet taste and sweet feeling of freedom from scrutiny specifically. All right, we continue on, not much more here. I'll try to speed things up. Having brown skin and a head covering means you're practically begging for a random T.S.A. check. I figured that out about the same time that I learned how to put on an airplane seatbelt on my own. So again, realize that she's making this connection between her age and her ability to do things on her own, her own linear maturation process, that now she's old enough to put on a seatbelt for her own. She's also old enough to realize that, hey, the way you look is maybe something that's important and is impacting your life. She talks about the brown skin. Again, she doesn't have, that's basically a comment that has embedded in it a lot. She's basically talking about racism there, obviously. And then she puts random in quotation marks, which means it wasn't necessary. They were being picked on. Now, we can examine this and we can talk about this. I don't personally agree with this account, but this is Ruhani's perspective, and then we have to understand where she's coming from. So our first blush reaction might be, oh, come on, seriously? Just because of your skin, you think it was random? No, come on, girl. It had everything to do with the fact that your father had this headdress that he could be hiding in, something underneath, that it's just security protocol. I can't wear a hat through a security checkpoint, and your dad can't wear a turban. All right, so it has nothing to do with the fact that you have brown skin, or you want to say it was random, you're being picked on. It's what I call the victimhood mentality, right? So we can approach that and we can analyze that. And if I was talking to Ruhani, I would have that conversation with her. However, again, we need to understand this through the prism of her eyes and her ethical lens and how she's approaching this based on her experience. This is her essay. So we're just here to read it, understand it, and make sense of it, and understand her in the process. So I just wanted to point that out, that you can have something in there that you disagree with or maybe might want to push back on, and that's fair, but just go with it for now. All right, so this time was significantly worse, this demand. Again, we have context for this, right? Why was it worse? Because it was the holidays. It's worse for everybody, Ruhani. I realize you're 12 years old and you don't quite have perspective yet, but going through the security checkpoint at Christmas is a nightmare for everybody. Trust me. Okay, still, I wanted him to comply. I wanted my dad to comply. Why? Because I wanted to rid myself. Keyword there is myself. Okay, she's not so much concerned about her dad and what he's going through and his resolute, sort of standing firm stance that he's taken on not removing his turban because of his religious fate of Sikhism. She's like, I wanted to rid myself. That's such a powerful word there, of the scathiness of being different. So I'm being put in a situation here as a 12-year-old girl that maybe has one foot in my former country, wherever that is, India, and one foot in the country I'm being raised at in America. And I feel different right now, and I don't like it, and I'm uncomfortable, and I want to, and here she says it, I want to rid myself of that feeling. Okay, and that's where the guilt comes in later for her. My father, who knew he would forever be considered different from the moment he walked into this country, persisted. I think this is an important line because this is something the dad chose, right? So the girl, Ruhani, had no choice. She was born into this country as a or she's pure, well, we can presume she's pure Indian. We don't know that. But culturally, she's in two different worlds, right? So she has her parents' world that she's in their household and speaks their language and eats their food and has their cultural traits. Again, a lot of this is presumptive, but we can make those assumptions. And then she has this part of her that lives in this world and speaks the language fluently without an accent and wants to dress like her friends, eat like her friends, think like her friends, and talk like her friends. And she didn't have that choice. Her father and dad put her in that position. The dad had the choice. He made the choice. And he made the choice knowing that he would be considered different. She didn't. So I think that's an important part to bring out. And that's also part of the ethos and the understanding and the empathy that she can build up for herself without even really saying it. She doesn't have to go in a long paragraph where she says, well, I didn't have the choice to come here and this whole reflective and introspective thing. No. All she needs to say is, my father knew this going in. He made that choice. And it's implied that I didn't have that choice Okay, so this is kind of unfair to me. He'd been to this airport before, and they let him have his turban scanned instead of removing it. What could have changed? Well, again, here it is right here. What could have changed, Ruhani? It's the holiday season, girl. Now, it's interesting that she says the palest officer. Again, this is one word, pale, that's telling you this is basically a white guy. Okay, we get that. Again, I'd love to sit down and talk to Ruhani. Maybe at one point I'll reach out to her. I'll email her. We'll have a dialogue. We'll invite her onto a Google Meets call or something, and we'll talk. But I think this is just too much, in my opinion. Okay, but that's how she feels. So she feels it was the palest officer. It wasn't just these other white people, and maybe there was an Hispanic guy there, and maybe some black security officers, but it was the whitest guy that she chose to, or that happened to speak up and say this line here. Security's tighter. Just make a decision. Can you see what this little girl's waiting to? So again, the security officer is even invoking the girl, saying she's impatient and she's probably just sitting there rolling her eyes and can't even look up and she's embarrassed. So it's this idea that now her and the security officer have a chance to he has a chance to kind of rope her in and get a little sympathy and say, hey, your daughter wants to, he's basically using this Ruhani's father's daughter, Ruhani herself, to kind of get his mission accomplished. It's like, hey, your daughter's, you're embarrassing your daughter. Let's get going, man. Come on. It's not even worth it. If I was embarrassed before, it was nothing compared to how I felt now. So now they mentioned that he literally acknowledged her, the security officer, hey, your girl, looks like she's rolling her eyes there. She's tapping her feet. She's getting embarrassed. She's hiding her face. Now she's really embarrassed because now it's about her. Remember before it was less about her. Now it's about her. It was also one of the reasons she didn't just sprint to the security checkpoint, right? She didn't want to make it about her. With all eyes on me, I wanted to shrink to the ground. I'd always feared the possibility of such humiliating precautions. Again, quotes, precautions. No, Ruhani, these are not air quote precautions. You're not a victim here. You and your dad, we're not picking on you. This is just the normal protocol that everybody has to go through. You guys are just outliers based on the turban. So it just kind of puts you guys in a difficult situation. I feel bad about that. And I'm empathetic and sympathetic, but I think it's too much to say that they're being put out for precautions. But she could be right, so I'll give her space for that possibility that she could be right and that they're just being picked on because of the way they look. Certainly there's an element to that, but I'm not willing to take it as far as she does. But let me just suspend those opinions and continue to read what she's writing here. I'd always feel the possibility of such humiliating precautions imposed on my father, and had always thought that I would speak up. Even a simple, don't talk to him that way would suffice. Yet I looked up, turned to my father and said, just take it off. And the way he sighed let me know that I'd won. It was a rather haunting victory. Again, she would this just take it off, which is also a metaphor for the airplane taking off, right? I just realized that. It became 2-on-1, the security officer and those other security officers, and now your daughter, and now everybody's against you. So we've all been in that situation, maybe with family, where now all of a sudden the family members or the kids are kind of nudging you along, or now they're against you too. Now it's over. He's going to have to definitely comply. If she would have kind of stood there in solidarity with him in that moment and even said something to the officer like, hey, don't talk to my dad that way, at least that would have kind of maybe, who knows what would have happened in that instance. But at that point, the dad knew it was over. And she did look up at him at that moment and tell him that. Perhaps I'm being too harsh on my younger self. This is her reflecting. This is the first time we realize that she's reflecting in a way later that she's going to reveal some sort of deeper meaning. And again, as you craft your essays, you can do this. You can basically tell your story as it unfolds, just like on a narrative plot. And then you get to this point where you're making sense of it. This is basically part of the resolution. After all, I was severely insecure and surrounded by years' worth of schoolyard ignorance. So why does your dad wear that rag? Which morphed into my buried shame. And it took me a while to realize I had to dispel it. It took me even longer to learn how. There's a little bit of exposition here. Exposition can be interlaced in different parts of the story, so we get a little bit more exposition here towards the back end of the story related to why she felt the way she felt. There's context here, right? So you can think of it as just context instead of exposition, if that helps you. It took me even longer to learn how she can dispel these feelings. In the years to come, I discovered the cathartic space of transcribing my feelings on paper. She's basically talking about making journal entries. At that moment, though, I simply internalized everything, the embarrassment, the confusion, and most of all, the gnawing guilt. I watched impassively as my father removed his turban. Every layer of meaningful fabric peeled away in front of the whole crowd. Okay, so this speaks to the fact that in that moment, she's not able, particularly in the emotions of that moment, she's not able to make sense of what's going on. She's confused. There's that word confused. She's embarrassed. There's a lot of emotions going on, and it's intense. It's chaotic. So she can't really make sense of her feelings, my feelings in that moment. But what she can do is she can write about it. So she can transcribe her feelings on paper. She can write about it after the fact, and in doing so, she can make sense of it in a more deep and meaningful way. So that's what Ruhani starts doing. It looks like she starts keeping a diary to make sense of all these incidents that are happening on the schoolyard, in the schoolyard, and at school, and with her friends, and at the airport, like this, incidents like this. And then it gets back to, so this is the resolution, right? Of the whole story. The resolution is I learned how to, if you were to put it on that plot line, it would basically be the sentence, I learned how to discover and make sense of and have cathartic space and meaning for these experiences through writing. Okay, that's the resolution. So we have the resolution, so that should be the end of the story, right? No, she goes back and she still puts in these last two paragraphs. Again, structurally, you can bounce around, you can craft it, you can make for a more powerful story. It would be boring if Ruhani would just told this story along the distinct plot lines. If she would have told this story on the distinct plot lines of the exposition, there's the exposition, including the playground incidents and her shame and her feelings, and then had the conflict of take that thing off. We finally reached the security checkpoint where the officer said, take that thing off, sir. And then all the rising action where they argued and went back and forth, and she considered running through the security checkpoint, and to the climatic moment where she said, Dad, just take it off. And then he takes it off, and then the falling action where they get the cinnamon bun and she feels guilt, and then the exposition is it wouldn't be as effective. So how you craft your story should not fit necessarily this diagram. This diagram is for junior high school students to basically produce an essay that makes a teacher happy. What you guys want to do is create powerful and impactful writing that imparts the meaning that you're trying to project in a way that's memorable and impactful. Last little bit here, the officers circling him like angry piranhas. Okay, remember, the dad is calm. The officers, though, they're the ones that took this personally, and they're mad, and they got a job to do. And we can also empathize with them, right? It's holiday season. They're stressed, too. They'd rather be home with their families or perhaps traveling themselves instead of being stuck in an airport for that 12-hour shift they're going to have to work every day because they need more staff, and the Security Transit Authority Administration, T.S.A, is short-staffed, and they're stressed too. They're dealing with angry customers all day long, and this is a tough job. So yeah, she can paint them as angry piranhas, as these monsters that are just taking bites out of people. But really, they're human beings too, and you have to kind of give them that space for understanding their perspective as well. So they took one long look and then dismissed us. So it's almost like they stared them down. They're angry piranhas. They got all their bites in, and then even as there was a distance that could only be impacted by the visual element, by looking, it's almost like they just continued to stare him down like, yeah, those people. Yeah. And then it was over. Keep in mind, this over, again, is not the resolution. This is part of the following action. So I want to be clear on that. That's part of the following action. That's not the resolution. It's over is not the over of the story. It's just an over of that episode or incident within the story. Or so I thought. My father, never one to hold a grudge, still bought me the cinnamon buns. I took him on the flight and looked out the window at the bright blue American sky, wondering why they didn't taste as sweet as before. Okay, final part of the story here. You always want to end your story on a bang, both in terms of meaning and rhetoric. I think Ruhani successfully does that here. She gives, again, we'll talk about white space. She gives this one line here, white space, as its own paragraph, right? And then thinking it's over, it's not. My dad was still that loving dad that still did what he always did. And even though I embarrassed him, and even though I didn't stand with him in solidarity and support him in that critical moment, as an emerging 12-year-old young adult, soon to be young adult within the next 4 or 5 years, he still loved me and supported me and did what he always did. Probably maybe a hallmark of his faith of Sikhism, I don't know, is just being, resolute and doing what you always, being consistent and doing what you always do. So he brought her the cinnamon buns. She took him on the flight and looked out the window at the bright blue American sky. Contrast here, the sky is bright and blue, but it doesn't quite represent for her maybe this notion of what America feels like it could be or should be for her. So again, there's a lot embedded there as far as meaning. The bright blue American sky wasn't quite as bright and blue. And now she's wondering, also using sensory language here, talking about bright blue American sky and the cinnamon buns not tasting as sweet as before. Obviously, there's a little bit of bitterness there because she regrets what she did. Not only what she did, but she feels a little bit of bitterness about the experience that she just went through with her dad, based on what she probably would interpret as racism. Okay, so I think this is important to analyze. I just want to give you guys just a look at how she pulled this off in 628 words. Tons of meaning here, tons of hidden meaning, puzzle pieces, Easter eggs. I want you guys to craft your stories and use language and word choice in a way such that she does here. We talk about the dreaded coroner, and we talk about how she uses these sentences and crafts them in such a way that there's a ton of meaning here. A word like piranha, using the sweetness of the cinnamon bun, and now that the fact that it's not sweet is a metaphor for everything that she's feeling emotionally and symbolically as far as her faith and who she is in this country. So take a look at all those elements and how they work together in such a small piece of writing, short piece of writing. If you have any questions, let me know.